They told the world that nations honor their debts, that sovereign promises are sacred, that governments, unlike men, do not default. But history keeps a different ledger, and in its pages, a pattern emerges. Stark, undeniable, unbroken. No country ever truly pays what it owes. Not in gold, not in silver, not in the currency that was promised, they pay in something else entirely. And the cost of that transformation rewrote the fate of empires. Before the age of paper promises, debt was simple. You borrowed grain, you returned grain. You borrowed silver, you returned silver. The same weight, the same purity, measured against the same sun that witnessed the contract. But as kingdoms expanded and wars demanded financing beyond harvest cycles, something had to change. By the 17th century, Europe was convulsing. Armies marched on credit. Navies floated on loans. The Spanish Empire, once glutted with New World silver, stood on the edge of collapse, having defaulted 13 times in less than 2 centuries. The French crown borrowed against future tax revenues that would not exist for generations. The English Parliament wrestled with a king who needed funds for wars he could not win. And across the merchant houses of Amsterdam, Genoa, and London, a quiet realization spread like fog over cold water. Governments do not repay debt, they transform it. In 1694, a group of English merchants made the crown an offer. They would lend the government £1.2 million, an astronomical sum, to fund its war against France. In return, they wanted something unprecedented, the right to issue paper notes backed by that debt, the right to create money itself. The Bank of England was born not as a bank in the traditional sense, but as an alchemical engine, one that transmuted sovereign debt into circulating currency. The loan was never meant to be repaid. It was meant to be perpetual. The interest payments, those would flow forever. The principal? It would remain, a foundation upon which an entire monetary system could be built. This was not default in the crude sense. No angry creditors storming Whitehall, no melted silverware shipped to Amsterdam. This was something far more elegant, a transformation. The debt did not disappear, it became the money. France, 1789. Across the Channel, the French crown had borrowed beyond reason wars in America. Palaces at Versailles. A fiscal machine so bloated it consumed half the nation's revenue just to service interest. When the king convened the Estates General to solve the crisis, the Third Estate had a different solution. They seized the printing press. The assignat was born, paper money backed by confiscated church lands. It was meant to retire the debt. Instead, it became the debt. Within 5 years, the assignat lost 99% of its value. Bread riots turned to revolution. The guillotine fell not just on aristocrats, but on the currency itself. The debt was not repaid. It was incinerated in hyperinflation. And the cost? Tens of thousands of lives. A continent thrown into war for a generation. By the spring of 1933, the world's wealthiest nation stood on the brink. Banks had failed by the thousands. Unemployment ravaged cities. And the debt, both public and private, had become a noose tightening around the throat of commerce. On April 5th, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. Americans were ordered to surrender their gold to the government at $20.67 per ounce. Then, in 1934, the government revalued gold at $35 per ounce, a 69% devaluation. Debts denominated in dollars were now repayable in currency, worth far less in real terms. Bondholders, domestic and foreign, were paid back in devalued paper. The Supreme Court upheld it. It was called pragmatism. It was called survival. But it was also a form of default, civilized, technocratic, wrapped in the language of emergency powers. The debt was honored in letter, but not in value. The Treaty of Versailles had demanded reparations in gold marks, a sum so vast it would take generations to pay. But the Weimar Republic faced a choice: economic collapse or monetary escape. They chose the printing press. By November 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend before the value evaporated. The debt, denominated in marks, was technically repaid, but in real terms, it was annihilated. Creditors received wheelbarrows of worthless paper, and from the wreckage of that hyperinflation, darker forces would rise, forces that would plunge the world into a war that killed 50 million. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television. The United States, he announced, would no longer convert dollars into gold. The Bretton Woods system, the architecture that had underpinned global finance since World War II, was dissolved with a single executive decision. Why? Because foreign governments, France, Germany, Japan, were demanding gold for their dollar reserves, and America's gold was running out. Rather than default overtly, Nixon changed the rules. The debt would still be paid, but not in gold, in paper, in promises, in the currency. America alone controlled the world convulsed. Currencies floated. Inflation ravaged the 1970s. But the United States did not collapse. It transformed its debt into the cornerstone of a new global order, one where dollars, backed by nothing but trust and military power, became the world's reserve. In each of these moments, someone paid. Not the government, not the treasury, not the politicians who signed the orders. The savers paid, the pensioners, the workers whose wages could no longer buy what they once could, the creditors, foreign and domestic, who had lent in good faith, believing in the sanctity of contracts. They were repaid, but not in value. Wealth did not disappear. It was redistributed from lender to borrower, from creditor to debtor, from those who saved to those who owed. And in the chaos of currency collapse, hyperinflation, and revaluation, new fortunes were made. Speculators who understood the game, insiders who moved before the announcements, governments that wielded the printing press like a weapon. This was not corruption in the traditional sense. It was the system working as designed. Debt, when it becomes unsustainable, is not resolved. It is dissolved through inflation, devaluation, or the most elegant trick of all, making the debt itself into money. Look at the world today. The United States carries over $36 trillion in debt. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 260%. Europe's southern nations remain chained to obligations they cannot service without central bank intervention. And yet, no defaults, no crises, no angry mobs storming central banks. Why? Because the game has changed. Modern sovereign debt is not denominated in gold, or silver, or any external anchor. It is denominated in the very currency the debtor prints. The Federal Reserve holds trillions in treasury bonds. The European Central Bank owns the debt of member nations. The Bank of Japan purchases its own government's obligations with freshly created yen. This is not a flaw in the system. This is the system. The debt will never be repaid. It will be rolled over, refinanced, absorbed into central bank balance sheets. And if inflation ticks higher, if the currency loses purchasing power year after year, well, that is simply the mechanism at work. A slow-motion transformation. Not a default, but not repayment either. They told the world that nations honor their debts. But history tells a different story. Nations honor their survival, their power, their ability to continue. And when those interests conflict with the sanctity of old promises, the promises bend, not through chaos, not through revolution, though sometimes those come too, but through the quiet alchemy of monetary policy, through the printing press, through the redefinition of money itself. The gold becomes paper. The paper becomes pixels. The debt becomes the money supply. And the cost? It is borne silently, invisibly, by those who do not understand the rules of the game. So ask yourself, if this happened in 1694, in 1923, in 1971, who holds that power now? And when the next transformation comes, and it will come, whose wealth will be dissolved to keep the system alive? If this changed how you see the world, subscribe. This is Memories of Money, where history still holds the receipts.